The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into today's powerful message, I want to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you so far? Whether you're watching this in the early morning hours as the sun rises, during your lunch break, in the middle of a busy day, or perhaps late at night when the world has quieted down, I want you to know that this moment we're sharing together is sacred. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Are you listening from bustling New York City, the peaceful countryside of Iowa, the sunny beaches of California, or maybe you're tuning in from across the globe in London, Sydney, or somewhere in between? Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are exactly where God wants you to be right now. If this is your first time joining us, I want to extend a warm welcome to our Sacred Rest family. We're so grateful you're here. And if you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for your continued faithfulness and support. Before we begin today's incredible story, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these life-changing messages that God has in store for us. Now let's prepare our hearts for what I believe will be one of the most dramatic, faith-building stories you'll hear. Today we're travelling back over 2,800 years to witness one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power ever recorded in human history. We're going to Mount Carmel in ancient Israel, where one man's faith stood against an entire nation's rebellion, where fire fell from heaven, and where hearts were turned back to the one true God. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Chapter 1. A nation in spiritual freefall. Picture, if you will, the ancient kingdom of Israel during one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just a time of political upheaval or economic hardship, though both of those existed. This was a time of complete spiritual catastrophe, a moment when an entire nation had turned its back on the God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the Promised Land. King Ahab sat on the throne of Israel, and beside him ruled Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation. Jezebel wasn't just content to worship false gods herself. She was determined to drag the entire nation of Israel down with her into the depths of idolatry and spiritual darkness. Under their reign, temples to Baal began sprouting up across the landscape like poisonous mushrooms after a storm. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, supposedly the controller of rain and fertility, the giver of crops and abundance. The people were drawn to him because they believed he could provide what they desperately needed: prosperity, security, and success. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we may not bow down to statues of Baal, but how many of us have made idols out of our careers, our bank accounts, our social media followers, or our pursuit of comfort and pleasure? The heart of humanity hasn't changed much in nearly 3,000 years. But Jezebel wasn't satisfied with just building temples. She launched a systematic persecution campaign against the prophets of the Lord. These faithful men and women of God were hunted down like criminals. Some were executed, others were forced to hide in caves and secret places, living in constant fear for their lives. The word of God was being silenced, and darkness was spreading across the land like a plague. Can you imagine living in such a time, when speaking the truth about God could cost you your life, when the very foundations of faith that had sustained a nation for generations were being torn down brick by brick, when it seemed like evil had won and righteousness had fled? Yet in the midst of this spiritual holocaust, God had his man. His name was Elijah, and he was about to become the most famous prophet in Israel's history. Chapter 2. The Drought of Divine Judgment. Before we meet Elijah face to face, we need to understand the backdrop against which his ministry unfolded. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the land of Israel. This wasn't just an inconvenient dry spell or a minor weather pattern. This was divine judgment, God's response to a nation that had forgotten him and chased after false gods. The drought was devastating in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend in our modern world of grocery stores and water systems. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up to cracked mud. Wells that had sustained families for generations ran completely dry. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died, and famine stalked the land like a relentless predator. People were desperate. Children cried from hunger. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned to dust. Merchants had nothing to sell, and families had nothing to eat. The very fabric of society was unravelling under the weight of this supernatural judgment. And yet, in their desperation, most of the people didn't turn back to the Lord. Instead, they cried out even more desperately to Baal, pleading with the storm god to send rain. They increased their sacrifices, intensified their rituals, and multiplied their prayers to deaf idols. They were convinced that if they just tried harder, if they just offered more, if they just believed with greater fervour, Baal would answer and the rains would come. But the skies remained as bronze hard and unyielding. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The drought continued, and Baal remained silent. This is the world into which God sent his prophet Elijah. Not a comfortable world of revival meetings and supportive congregations, but a hostile environment where speaking God's truth could mean death, where the majority had embraced lies and where the very elements seemed to declare that God's judgment was upon the land. Chapter 3. Enter Elijah, the man of fire. Elijah appears in the biblical narrative like a bolt of lightning splitting the darkness. We don't know much about his background or his early life. He's introduced simply as Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. No impressive genealogy, no royal connections, no seminary degrees or credentials. Just a man from a small town that most people had probably never heard of. But what Elijah lacked in pedigree, he more than made up for in faith, courage, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the one true God. While the nation around him bowed to Baal, Elijah stood firm. While others compromised and conformed, Elijah remained faithful. While the majority chose the easy path of popular religion, Elijah chose the narrow way of truth. God had sustained Elijah supernaturally during the 3 years of drought. First, he had sent him to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, where a handful of flour and a little oil miraculously sustained 3 people for over a year. These experiences had built Elijah's faith to an unshakable level. He had seen God's provision in impossible circumstances. He had witnessed miracles that defied natural law. He had learned to trust completely in God's power and faithfulness, even when everything around him suggested that God had forgotten or abandoned his people. Now, as the drought entered its 3rd year, God was ready to use his seasoned servant for the greatest demonstration of divine power Israel had seen since the days of Moses. The time had come for a showdown that would echo through the ages, a confrontation that would prove once and for all who was the true God and who were merely the inventions of human imagination. Chapter 4. The Divine Commission. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with crystal clarity. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was time for the drought to end, but first there would be a reckoning. God wasn't just going to quietly restore the rain and let everyone go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. He was going to make a statement that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Elijah set out to find King Ahab, but Ahab was already looking for him. The king had been searching throughout his own kingdom and in neighbouring nations, trying to find the prophet he blamed for the drought. When Ahab finally encountered Elijah, his greeting was filled with accusation and anger. "Is that you troubler of Israel?" Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a king who had led his nation into idolatry, who had allowed his wife to murder God's prophets, who had built temples to false gods throughout the land, and he had the nerve to call God's faithful prophet a troublemaker. It's a perfect example of how sin blinds us to our own responsibility and causes us to blame others for the consequences of our own choices. But Elijah didn't back down. With the boldness that comes from knowing you're standing on the side of truth, he fired back. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." This wasn't just a theological debate or a polite disagreement about religious preferences. This was a confrontation between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between the power of the Almighty and the impotence of human-made idols. Chapter 5. The challenge issued. Elijah then issued a challenge that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Mount Carmel was the perfect location for this showdown. Rising about 1,800 feet above sea level, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and could accommodate the massive crowd that would gather. More importantly, Mount Carmel was considered sacred to Baal worship. The Canaanites believed it was one of Baal's favourite dwelling places. By choosing this location, Elijah was essentially challenging Baal on his home turf. The terms of the contest were elegantly simple. "Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." It was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated rituals, no ambiguous signs that could be interpreted different ways, no room for trickery or deception. Fire from heaven would be the ultimate proof. The God who could send fire to consume the sacrifice would be proven to be the true God. The people's response revealed both their spiritual confusion and their deep hunger for truth. What you say is good. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of not knowing which God to trust, tired of the drought and the suffering. They wanted a clear answer, and Elijah's challenge offered exactly that. Chapter 6. The prophets of Baal take the stage. As dawn broke over Mount Carmel, an incredible scene began to unfold. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered around their altar, dressed in their ceremonial robes, carrying their ritual instruments, confident in their God's ability to answer their call. After all, they outnumbered Elijah 450 to 1. They had the backing of the royal court. They had been the religious establishment for years. Surely their God would not fail them now, especially not on his sacred mountain. They began their ritual early in the morning with great enthusiasm and confidence. "Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices echoing across the mountainside. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their movements becoming more and more frenzied as they worked themselves into a religious fervour. This wasn't a quiet, dignified ceremony. This was raw, primal religion at its most intense. They leaped and shouted, they waved their arms and beat their chests. They called upon their God with every fibre of their being. The sound of their voices, the pounding of their feet, the clashing of their instruments created a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. But as the morning wore on and became noon, something became increasingly obvious. Nobody was answering. The sky remained clear and cloudless. No fire fell from heaven. No voice spoke from the heavens. The altar remained cold and lifeless, despite all their passionate pleading. You have to understand, these weren't insincere men going through empty motions. These prophets genuinely believed in Baal. They had devoted their lives to serving him. They had staked their reputations, their careers, and their very identities on the belief that he was real and powerful. The failure of their God to respond wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating to everything they had built their lives upon. Chapter 7. Elijah's Divine Sarcasm. As the noon sun blazed overhead and the prophets of Baal continued their increasingly desperate rituals, Elijah decided it was time for some divine commentary. With a wit that was both cutting and brilliant, he began to mock their futile efforts. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Can you imagine the scene? Here's Elijah, one man against 450, calmly watching their frantic efforts and offering helpful suggestions for why their God might not be responding. The sarcasm was devastating because it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. If Baal was truly the almighty storm god they claimed he was, why would he need to be awakened? Why would he be too busy or distracted to answer his devoted followers in their hour of greatest need? But Elijah's mockery served a deeper purpose than just humiliating the false prophets. He was exposing the fundamental weakness of all false gods. They are not truly there. They cannot hear because they have no ears. They cannot speak because they have no voice. They cannot act because they have no power. They are creations of human imagination, given form by human hands, but possessing no divine substance. The prophets of Baal, stung by Elijah's taunts and desperate to prove their God's reality, intensified their efforts to an almost unbelievable degree. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, following their religious traditions until their blood flowed freely. This wasn't just symbolic, this was literal self-mutilation in the name of religious devotion. From noon until evening, they continued this horrific display, their voices growing hoarse from shouting, their bodies weakened by loss of blood, their spirits crushed by the growing realization that their God was not going to answer. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, frantic activity and desperate self-harm producing nothing. On the other side, one man waiting calmly for his turn, confident in his God's ability to act. Chapter 8. Elijah prepares his altar. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally exhausted themselves in defeat, Elijah stepped forward to take his turn. But before he called upon the Lord, he had some important work to do. "Come here to me," he called to all the people. This wasn't going to be a private ceremony or a mystical ritual performed in secret. Everything Elijah was about to do would be in full view of hundreds or perhaps thousands of witnesses. There would be no opportunity for trickery, no possibility of deception, no room for doubt about what actually happened. The first thing Elijah did was repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This altar represented the nation's covenant relationship with God, a relationship that had been broken by years of idolatry and rebellion. By repairing it, Elijah was symbolically calling the nation back to their true identity as God's chosen people. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for generations. In God's eyes, his people were still one nation, still his chosen ones, still the objects of his covenant love, despite their unfaithfulness. Each stone was a reminder of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, promises that remained in effect despite the people's rebellion. With these 12 stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold about 15 litres of water. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was about to serve a very important purpose in demonstrating that what was about to happen could only be attributed to divine intervention. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Act of Faith. What Elijah did next was so audacious, so seemingly foolish, that it takes your breath away. Remember, this was in the 3rd year of a devastating drought. Water was more precious than gold. People were dying of thirst. Every drop was carefully conserved and rationed. And Elijah ordered 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Can you imagine the gasps from the crowd? Can you picture the shock on people's faces as they watched precious, life-giving water being poured out lavishly over an altar? Some in the crowd probably thought Elijah had lost his mind. Others might have been angry at what seemed like a wasteful display. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. And they did it a second time, pouring out 4 more jars of precious water over the sacrifice and the wood. "Do it a 3rd time," Elijah commanded. And a 3rd time they soaked the altar until the water ran down around it and filled the trench he had dug. 12 jars of water in total. Everything was completely saturated. The wood was soaked through. The sacrifice was drenched. The stones were wet. Even the ground around the altar was muddy with water. If anyone had been planning to suggest that Elijah had somehow hidden fire or used trickery to ignite his altar, that possibility was now completely eliminated. This act of faith was staggering. Elijah was so confident in God's power that he was willing to make the miracle as difficult as possible. He wasn't just asking God to light dry wood. He was asking him to consume a sacrifice that was literally underwater. He was putting his reputation, his ministry, and his very life on the line, betting everything on God's ability to do the impossible. Chapter 10. The Prayer that Shook Heaven and Earth. As evening approached and the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, Elijah stepped up to the altar he had prepared. The moment had come. Everything led to this point. The drought, the confrontation with Ahab, the challenge to the prophets of Baal, the repair of the altar, the soaking with water, all of it was preparation for this moment when one man would call upon the name of the Lord. But notice what Elijah didn't do. He didn't scream and shout like the prophets of Baal. He didn't dance wildly, or cut himself, or work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals, or recite complicated incantations. He simply prayed, and his prayer was a model of faith, simplicity, and complete dependence upon God. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel," he began, immediately identifying the God he served not as a local deity or a tribal god, but as the God of the covenant, the God who had made promises to the patriarchs and had been faithful to those promises for generations. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." This wasn't about Elijah's reputation or glory. This wasn't about proving his own power or wisdom. This was about demonstrating to a watching world that the Lord alone is God, and that Elijah was merely his obedient servant. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The purpose of the miracle wasn't to show off or to defeat enemies, but to turn hearts back to God. This was an act of divine love, a desperate attempt to rescue a nation from the spiritual destruction they had brought upon themselves. The prayer was short, simple, and powerful. No theatrical performance, no manipulation of emotions, no attempt to work up faith through human effort. Just a straightforward request from a faithful servant to his all-powerful God. Chapter 11. Fire falls from heaven. What happened next has never been equalled in human history. The response to Elijah's prayer was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely unmistakable. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame that gradually grew, not a spark that ignited the wood, not a natural phenomenon that could be explained by meteorology or chemistry. This was supernatural fire, divine fire, holy fire that blazed down from the throne of God himself. And this fire didn't just consume the sacrifice, it didn't just burn up the wood, it consumed everything. The offering was instantly vaporized. The wood disappeared in a flash. The 12 stones that Elijah had so carefully arranged were completely consumed. Even the soil around the altar was burned up. The water in the trench, all those precious gallons that had been poured out, was licked up by the divine flames as if it had never been there. The heat must have been incredible. The light must have been blinding. The sound must have been like thunder echoing across the mountainside. Everyone watching would have felt the power of God in a way that shook them to their very core. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of absolute divine authority. God was making a statement that could not be ignored, denied, or explained away. He was declaring to Israel, to the prophets of Baal, to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and to everyone watching, that he alone is God, that he alone has power over the elements, and that he alone deserves worship and obedience. Chapter 12. The people's response. When the people saw the fire fall from heaven and consume everything on the altar, their response was immediate and overwhelming. They fell prostrate on the ground, not just kneeling, but face down in the dirt, overwhelmed by the presence and power of the Almighty God. And they cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Think about what this meant. Many of these same people had been worshipping Baal just hours before. They had been convinced that the storm god was real and powerful. They had invested their hopes, their prayers, and their sacrifices in a false deity. But now, confronted with undeniable evidence of God's power, they acknowledged the truth they had been running from for 3 years. This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement or a polite religious sentiment. This was a deep, heart-level recognition of divine authority. They had seen something that shattered their old beliefs and transformed their understanding of spiritual reality. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God their fathers had worshipped. He was the true God, and all other gods were mere pretenders. The cry, "The Lord, He is God," became a declaration of faith that echoed across the mountainside and down through the centuries. It was a moment of national awakening, a turning point when an entire people group remembered who they were and whose they were. Chapter 13. Justice and Restoration. But the story didn't end with the people's declaration of faith. God's justice demanded that those who had led the nation astray face the consequences of their deception. Under Elijah's direction, the people seized the 450 prophets of Baal who had spent the day proving the powerlessness of their God. This might seem harsh to our modern sensibilities, but we need to understand the context. These men had been leading an entire nation away from the true God. They had been accomplices in the persecution and murder of God's true prophets. They had been teaching lies in the name of religion. deceiving people who were desperately seeking spiritual truth. Their deception had contributed to the spiritual darkness that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Justice was swift and final. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed, removing the source of false teaching that had poisoned the nation's spiritual life. With the false prophets dealt with and the people's hearts turned back to God, it was time for the next phase of God's plan, the restoration of his blessing upon the land. Chapter 14. The sound of abundant rain. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The weather conditions were identical to what they had been for 3 years. Hot, dry, and utterly cloudless. But Elijah had the faith to hear the sound of rain that existed only in the promise of God. This is the kind of faith that sees the invisible and hears the inaudible. Elijah wasn't looking at circumstances or relying on weather forecasts. He was trusting in the word of God, who had promised to send rain upon the land. While Ahab went to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and threw himself down on the ground in prayer. This wasn't a casual request or a polite religious ritual. This was intense, fervent prayer from a man who understood that he was participating in God's plan to restore his people. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for signs of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. There is nothing there. But Elijah didn't give up. He didn't doubt God's promise or question his own faith. He kept praying, kept believing, kept expecting God to fulfill his word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To most people, a tiny cloud on the horizon wouldn't seem significant, especially after 3 years of drought. But to the eyes of faith, that small cloud was the beginning of God's abundant provision. Elijah immediately told his servant to run to Ahab with this message: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Chapter 15. The Storm of Restoration. What followed was one of the most dramatic weather changes in recorded history. The tiny cloud that had appeared on the horizon quickly grew and multiplied. The sky, which had been clear blue for 3 years, suddenly turned black with storm clouds. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, and then the rain began to fall. But this wasn't a gentle shower or a light drizzle. This was a torrential downpour, a deluge that made up for 3 years of drought in a matter of hours. The rain came down in sheets so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The ground, which had been hard as concrete from years of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and soon rivers of rainwater were flowing down every hillside and through every valley. It was as if God was saying, "You thought I had forgotten how to send rain? You believed that Baal was the god of storms? Let me show you what real divine power looks like." The storm was so intense that King Ahab, travelling in his royal chariot, had difficulty making the journey back to his palace in Jezreel. But here's one of the most amazing details of the entire story. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Picture this scene. A middle-aged prophet who had just spent an entire day in intense spiritual warfare, who had just called down fire from heaven and orchestrated the execution of 450 false prophets who had just prayed intensely for rain. This same man was given supernatural strength to outrun a horse-drawn chariot for about 17 miles through a driving rainstorm. This wasn't natural human endurance. This was divine empowerment, God's way of putting an exclamation point on the entire day's events. Even in the storm, even in the exhaustion that should have followed such an intense spiritual battle, God's power was sufficient to carry his faithful servant. Chapter 16. Lessons for today. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is far more than just an exciting historical account. It's a template for understanding how God works in our world today and how he calls each of us to live lives of faith and courage. First, we see the power of standing alone for truth. Elijah was outnumbered 450 to 1, but he wasn't really alone because God was with him. In our culture today, it often feels like those who stand for biblical truth are vastly outnumbered by those who have embraced the false gods of our age. Materialism, relativism, hedonism, and secular humanism. But numbers don't determine truth, and God's power isn't limited by human statistics. Second, we learn that false gods will always disappoint. The prophets of Baal cried out to their God from morning until evening, but he never answered because he wasn't real. Today's false gods, money, success, pleasure, power, technology, entertainment, promise fulfillment, but can never deliver on their promises. Only the true God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. Third, we see that God often chooses to work through ordinary people who have extraordinary faith. Elijah wasn't from a prominent family or an influential background. He was just a man who believed God and was willing to stake everything on that belief. God is still looking for such people today, men and women who will trust him completely and obey him fully, regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. Fourth, we learn the importance of prayer in the life of faith. Elijah's prayer was simple but powerful because it was offered in complete faith and alignment with God's will. He wasn't trying to manipulate God or impress people. He was simply communicating with his heavenly Father and trusting him to act according to his promises. Fifth, we see that God's miracles often come after periods of preparation and testing. The 3 years of drought weren't just punishment for sin, they were preparation for a miracle. God was setting the stage for a demonstration of his power that would be undeniable and unforgettable. Sometimes what looks like delay in our lives is actually divine preparation for something greater than we could imagine. Conclusion. Where is your Mount Carmel? As we conclude this incredible story, I want to ask you a personal question. Where is your Mount Carmel? What situation in your life is calling for a clear demonstration of God's power and faithfulness? What false gods have you been trusting instead of the one true God? What impossible circumstance are you facing that only divine intervention can resolve? Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems hopeless and you need God to provide for your needs in supernatural ways. Perhaps you're dealing with a health challenge that has left doctors puzzled, and you need the great physician to demonstrate his healing power. It could be that you're struggling with a relationship that seems beyond repair, and you need the God of restoration to work a miracle in your marriage or family. Or maybe your Mount Carmel is more internal. Maybe you've been worshipping the false gods of success, approval, comfort, or control, and you need to experience the reality of God's presence and power in a fresh way. Maybe you've been trying to live the Christian life in your own strength, and you need to discover what it means to depend completely on God's power rather than your own abilities. The same God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire from heaven is still on the throne today. He still hears the prayers of his people. He still demonstrates his power in impossible situations. He still turns hearts back to himself and brings restoration where there has been devastation. But like Elijah, we must be willing to stake everything on God's faithfulness. We must be prepared to stand alone if necessary, to trust when circumstances seem impossible, to pray with faith rather than doubt, and to give God the opportunity to show his power in ways that will leave no doubt about his reality and love. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel that day wasn't just about proving that the Lord is God, though it certainly did that. It was about a loving father reaching out to his wayward children, demonstrating his power not to destroy them but to draw them back to himself. It was about restoration, redemption, and the kind of love that will go to any lengths to rescue those who are precious to him. That same love is reaching out to you today. That same power is available to you in your situation. That same God who answered Elijah is waiting to answer your prayers and demonstrate his faithfulness in your life. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to trust him completely, to step out in faith even when the odds seem impossible, and to give him the opportunity to show his power in your Mount Carmel moment. So I challenge you today, don't settle for the false gods of our culture. Don't be satisfied with a powerless religion that looks good on the surface, but lacks the reality of divine presence. Cry out like the people on Mount Carmel, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And then watch as the fire of his presence transforms your impossible situation into a testimony of his faithfulness and power. The same God who sent fire from heaven is ready to move in your life today. Are you ready to trust him completely and see what he will do? Remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more life-changing messages like this one. Until next time, may you know the reality of God's presence and power in every area of your life. God bless you.
Hello dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not, a king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on, and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah son of Imlah was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, your majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool. Despite his many moral failings, he had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd," Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace.'" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political manoeuvring they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him, and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. There was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life, while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home, absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication, but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring, but he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency, contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot, and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king, who had tried to outwit divine judgment, slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth-Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage, inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that, like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.